What we're going to do today is talk about the Renaissance, but I want to sort of go back to something that I talked about last week or the last lecture when I talked about the this 0 point. And so I want to put that condition on this again to say that, can everyone see the screen here? So if we go back to what Mignolo was talking about, what he was really talking about was the idea that the Renaissance effectively had established a 0 point after which civilization was seen to exist, prior to which things were classified as the Dark Ages. And I think it's an important thing to realise because there's some people who would argue that modernity or modernism started then at the Renaissance, because we have the starts of scientific rationality. We have the institutionalization of and conjunction of Christianity with sort of Platonic and Greco-Roman history and theory and science, etc. We also have the appropriation of Islamic science into the fold of the West, which of course we know a lot of the earliest science that we have comes from Islam, which was appropriated through the process of the Crusades. And so in a way what it's doing is it's starting this point to differentiate an us and them, and also a furthest extent of the world, which is outside of which is, difference, etc. The edge of the map was always centred around Europe. And so I think it's important to sort of put that in there as a bit of a proviso, and also at the same time as I'm talking about Italian Renaissance gardens, is to recognise that this is part of that process. And so it's also, and in a way, I also have to recognise that landscape architecture, although I made a case last week that landscape architecture is not about objects, it's about practices, it's about change over time, you can't really take out the fact that landscape architecture has a particular trajectory, and that it's a colonial or a sort of an invention of a particular way of thought. Now, it's interesting to start here and talk about the Renaissance garden because it's a really important precedent in the history of landscape architecture, because what it really does is a lot of the languages that we have now of working with landscapes come from Renaissance gardens. And so, for example, what I'm going to show you now and talk about particularly in the second project here is about what's known as the Villa Aldobrandini, is that in a way a lot of this campus is actually generated from particular sort of techniques and landscape techniques that you'd see in these gardens. And if you go through the history of landscape architecture, when it really developed, it developed out of the Beaux-Arts, which is the French design school, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and that was the 19th century garden, or the 19th century city was modern in technological terms, but was still very classical in design terms. And so a lot of the way that, for example, domestic gardens, which were landscape architecture, was about rich people's gardens at the same time as it was about parks, a lot of that language is Italianate in the way it operates. And so I'm not here to advocate for this being the origin, but I think it's in the history of landscape, which we would be remiss to be teaching you. It's important to note these, the role of it in the discipline. And it's also, if we start there, you have to excuse me if I have like a whole lot of facts that I've cut and pasted together. It's because I can't keep it all in my mind, so I'll occasionally refer to them. Now, the first thing we'll talk about, though, is actually much earlier, which is the Villa Adriana. And so this is where you have an interesting point, because I'm talking about, in a way, Renaissance gardens in Renaissance. When is the Renaissance? You guys have all studied something about this before. When's the Renaissance? Sorry? No, it was about the 15th, 16th century we're talking about here. And so it's tied to a whole lot of things, one of which is money and trade. And so this is where also you can't separate the Renaissance out of the fact that this is a period where Columbus ends up in the Americas. This is the period where people are starting to move down the Cape. The Portuguese are moving around. This is the expansion of empire, is this period, and the appropriation of stuff from multiple other places into the canon. But at the same time, it's also, as we can see here, it's reaching back into the classical period, or the Roman Empire. And so Villa Adriana, the reason I start here is that Villa Adriana, which was the villa of the Emperor Hadrian in about 200 AD, before what they would call the sacking of Rome, and that period is really, this is the origin of the Villa Garden. And so you can't really tell the story of the Renaissance without talking about the classical in some way, because it's also a return to empire in Italy to some extent. And so obviously this period, is pre-Christian. So even though it's 200 AD, it's before the Roman Empire became the Holy Roman Empire. And so it's important to recognize that, in a way, the Holy Roman Empire was a process of conjoining the Greco-Roman, and the Romans, of course, had been stealing and not stealing, but culturally appropriating from the Greeks, and of course the Greeks had been culturally appropriating from the Egyptians. And so, there's a whole kind of trope around the idea that Greco-Roman culture comes from Egypt, which was a black empire. And this is largely a kind of other thing is also happening a lot at the moment if you start to look at some of the cultural discourse at the moment. And so it's also interesting to think about the fact that the villa is not part of the city. The villa is, that when suburbia first happened, it was known as the Suburban Villa. And so the villa is inherently a suburban concept. It's suburban. It's not part of the city. So if we think about the fact that the relationship of the city in the old cities is a situation where we have the city as a solid through which a street is cut, where the house is part of a dense fabric, and then we invert that, where in a way where the house as an object is sitting in the landscape. That's one of the most basic landscape relationships that we'll talk all the way through your program about. And so in a way, you can only occupy the landscape like that when the landscape is no longer dangerous or threatening. And so therefore, the fact that there are villas in the landscape, and the fact that Hadrian actually was ruling the empire 28 kilometres from Rome with a postal service constantly running messages, tells you that the countryside was secure in empire at that point in time. And so the idea that the period of the Renaissance, which is after the Dark Ages, which the 0 point, tells you that there is a perceived sense of a return to security in the landscape, and that the landscape is no longer dangerous, pagan, all of those kind of things. The landscape is safe enough that you can have dwelling outside the city wall itself being a feature of the pre-Renaissance Dark Age organic city. The city which was also largely informal. So if we think about the fact that the trajectory of cities, a lot of the time up until this period, had been an organic growth. Now, in the 19th century, we know that the growth of Paris was also an organic growth, and there was informality all around European cities as well. And the process of creating boulevard, all of these other things, were a process of formalisation. Now, if you think about that where we're from, we're also in a situation where there's transitions and flux around formality and informality. It's important to think of the fact that the European city was doing exactly the same thing. In actual fact, the Renaissance was the period where people like Sixtus V cut axes through Rome. Later on in Italy, the same thing happened. The structuring of a city which had organically developed. So the villa, in a way, is like skipping. The Villa Adriana I'm talking about is about skipping between and bypassing that period of the alleged Dark Ages to move back to a sense of order, a sense of control. Now, there's a really great book called The Passion of the Western Mind, which is a book that looks at the philosophical development of Western thought, which plots the process by which Greco-Roman thought and Christianity were joined during this period, when they would actually have seemed to be antithetical. So if you think about the fact that Christianity did not believe in, it was a monotheistic religion, it believed in one God. It was a sort of like it was a sort of a mental religion to some extent. Like, when the Christians turned up to Mexico and offered the Aztecs the sacrament, the Aztecs had been eating magic mushrooms and having visions, and so they said, please give us the sacrament, we want to meet your gods. And then they took the sacrament and they said, this is not real, there's nothing here, because they had literal hallucinations from their sacraments. And so the idea that Christianity was an internal mental connection, and this is not me putting a position around God or otherwise, this is a particular interpretation, the fact that that could get conjoined with the Greco-Roman thought was really important. And so things like concepts like the Platonic become quite interesting. So the Platonic is the idea that there is a perfect table, a perfect archetype of the table somewhere up there, and this is an imperfect manifestation of the perfect table. Otherwise, how could we recognise it? Is also resonant with the idea of heaven as a perfect place in which the earthly realm is a poor manifestation of it. And so the creation of the villa is a link back to a sort of Christian period, linking back to a pre-Christian heritage. Now, Villa Adriana has a whole lot of things in it which were appropriated back into the Italianate Renaissance garden. And so it's worth sort of talking about those things. It's also worth noting that once Hadrian had died, the Villa Adriana continued to be used by his successive emperors, including Marcus Aurelius, etc., and that the sort of scale of it and it's a bit like a city, results from the fact that when he moved his court there was basically, they had to assemble a massive amount of building to allow it to be allow it to function as a sort of the seat of the empire. Now, it's also interesting that during the sort of sacking of Rome, which is about 500 AD. So obviously, if we know when was the Nicene Creed put together? 313. Yes. So we can see that the transfer of the seat of the Roman Empire to Constantinople or Istanbul was a process of dealing with the territorial shifts that were happening in the region of Rome as the Ostrogoths and the Byzantines were fighting in this region. And what's interesting about this place is that there's very little left over in this complex because of the fact that it was stripped and stripped and stripped of stuff again and again and again. Now, we see a whole lot of, materially when you visit there, and I've told you before that I only talk about projects generally that I've visited, but, it's interesting when you visit this that you realise, concrete was a material that the Romans were building with. They had toilets, they had a whole lot of stuff that we would now understand as a sort of modern things. And so, materially, really the only things that remain in Hadrian's villa are those aspects that were not able to be removed. In actual fact, the Ostrogoths used the facility of Hadrian's villa as a place to store stuff, and also what they did is they also made marble. So they melted down all of the marble to make lime, and so basically they just totally, the term is spoliated, but they just totally took over everything. And so in a way, the features that we see, the main sort of features that we see in it are this sort of features that come forward now, things like this large kind of grotto we see here, where that's called the Serapeum, and we also see here this long pool, which is called the Canopus. And we can see bits and pieces of sculpture that were actually returned for the process of showing what this place used to look like. But you know, we can see things that you might see in Cape Town here, right? Isn't that a pine we'd see in Cape Town there? Stone pine, right? And so you can see that in a way, you know, the visions of empire always come with the Italianate. You know, Washington, D.C., all of the big cities in the world try to appropriate the Italianate as a way of saying we are an empire, you know, and you see it here at UCT. You know, the look of that landscape, you know, and it's been, you know, these are not old trees, so you can tell that it's had a heritage jobby done on it. And so, you know, we've got the pencils, you know, the pencil cypress, we've got olives, we've got oleander, you know, we have all of these species, plane trees, we have all these species that are very ubiquitous now that were populating that landscape. Now, you know, flash forward, what's also interesting was that a garden that we'll talk about a little later, that in the 16th century, a lot of the statuary were here, the remaining marble and statues, were actually taken to another garden that we'll talk about called the Villa d'Este. And so, you know, this place was totally sacked over and over again by successive regimes. Now, it's an amazing, you know, it's quite an amazing labyrinth of a place to visit. And if you find yourself in Italy, which is, you know, we're all colonials here in the sense of, you know, we come from this part of the world. It's always an amazing thing to go to, I find, to go to places like this. Also, we see columns, we see all those things that we'd expect. Now, one of the key things that also was done here, and one of the reasons why it was established, was that, in actual fact, there were existing viaducts that were, aqueducts that were coming through the area on their way to Rome. And so the other thing to understand about the modernism or the modernity of the Italian garden was that it was part of a big hydraulic engineering project, which was also, you know, part of landscape. And so you can't separate the creation of ornamental landscape from the process of irrigation. As much as we're going to other sorts of gardens, to some extent, irrigation presupposes the garden, because otherwise what you have is just have nature. So what are the three types of nature?
The garden, the wilderness, and
the wrong way around. Which is the first nature? The wilderness, right? What's the second nature? Agriculture. And the third nature? The garden. And so this is a term, you know, obviously if you read those readings, you know, it's interesting to see in the context of what we were talking about from Mignolo again, where he was arguing that with the Renaissance and this process becomes a separation between culture and nature, where in actual fact those areas that were outside Europe were effectively treating people as part of nature. They were treating other cultures as part of nature because only culture was available in the Renaissance. And so, you know, this process of creating a garden is very much a process of manipulating nature. Later on, we'll talk about the concept of the landscape cyborg, the idea that the landscape is actually a synthetic construct now between you know, technology and nature, where it's not a separation anymore, and you can see that in these kind of gardens. Now, this one's a bit later, but I jumped to it because it has a whole lot of ingredients that are really important. This is called the Villa Aldobrandini, and the Villa Aldobrandini is quite near where, well, it's, you know, all of these villas were within a kind of orbit of Rome of about 20 k's. So a distance where you could comfortably get in and out of the city in a day or something like that by horseback, you know. And so they're all in the orbit. And so Tivoli, which we'll talk about quite a lot, which is also along the Tiber, which is one of the most famous sort of rivers of Rome. Frascati is another one. Now, the Villa Aldobrandini, I think, is interesting, and a lot of this is interesting because of the fact that the villa is really more than anything else about topography. It's about the negotiation between a steep landscape and a horizontal surface. Because obviously when, the whole of activities are based around, one of the first things humans do in terms of establishing a terrain is to normalise it enough to operate. And sort of town making, village making activities are always first about creating some sort of space, whether it be a kraal, whether it be the sort of similar sort of thing you'd see to that in the Amazon, whether it be a plaza. That levelling process is part of the same operation. And so if we look at the Villa Aldobrandini, what we see are some classic sort of things, and one is the sort of, obviously, the use of symmetry, and you have to say that is part of this period. You can't pretend it's not a process of part of that period. And so part of form making tends to be the making of symmetry. And so here we can see we have a great axis towards the house, and here is the main house, and then along that we have a terrace along there where the house is located, and behind the house we have the forest. And so we're also seeing it's also a kind of metaphorical thing. Now in the house there's something known as the piano nobile. And the piano nobile is the first floor. And so if we look down here and have a look, I can't see my mouse at all, but let's just assume I know where it is. If we look here, you see that the piano nobile is actually this level here. And so the first floor of the piano nobile is about the view, because from the ground floor you don't necessarily normally get a view. So everything in the Italianate garden was generally generated from the piano nobile up here, where you get an elevation. Now obviously in this garden you get a whole lot of elevation anyway. And so a lot of the time, and we'll see this, you can't also exempt the fact that the garden is associated with territory, as we discussed, and the garden is associated with wealth. And so a lot of the time, the garden of all the gardens we're going to talk about that have become part of the canon of landscape are private spaces associated with wealthy people. Now, the process of retaining and moving through is generally always about different sorts of switchbacks. And so we're always going from one switchback ramp to another switchback ramp to another switchback ramp, crisscrossing our way back up to the structure. And you can see that in a pragmatic way, a lot of the time, the features that we know of as the grotto were about adorning, we can see over here and over here, we're about adorning the face of a retaining wall, you have to say. It's a basic thing to talk about. But so much of the language of the Italian garden is about adorning functional items that are about grade negotiation. And so that whether it be, ornamenting a handrail, whether it be building in a grotto, an edge wall, etc. And so when you move into this sort of garden and you start to move onto the main sort of surface of the garden, in the space between, where are we? In the space between the building, I really cannot see my mouse. It is quite weird. Where am I? You can't see it either, can you? Why can you see it and I can't see it? That is really strange. And so if you look here, you can see there is this space between the back of this building and this, what's known as a water theatre. And so that's the sort of space through there. And so it's this is the terrace this is a sort of ceremonial approach across the terrace into the garden. And in that process, you're passing across and through through these kind of spaces until you arrive at the main house, where you would be, deposited here and enter the house, and on the other side is this water theatre. Now, this project, was actually started in 1550, and one of the interesting things I always find, are any of you guys Italian? It's not a problem, but just to be a bit safe here, the mafia. But one of the things I think is interesting is, Italian culture is about the family, and also in these landscapes, it's also about, and in this period, it was really about the relationship of families to the Vatican. And so a lot of the time, like if you go, who's been to the Vatican here? Do you remember what it says when you go into the Vatican? I can't remember the name. Oh yeah, it says Borghese across the top of the Vatican, and that's actually the family Borghese. So in other words, when the family of the Borghese, what they were doing was they were also building up their relationship to the Vatican. They were probably involved in a thing where they were getting money, giving money, and they were branding the Vatican as their own, you know. And you have to see this in the process. I mean, you know, this is a very Protestant country, South Africa, and so you have to see that in the process of Martin Luther and the process of actually returning to a Christianity that wasn't based around patronage, etc. So anyway, these guys were, you know, this was a Vatican, this guy this is actually a papal garden that's not owned by the Vatican. And it's still owned by the Aldobrandini family since that period. And so a lot of the time this was given to Aldobrandini by the Pope in recognition of his services in organising a treaty amongst all the papal states. And the building itself was undertaken by the architect Giacomo della Porte, or Giacomo della Porte, and it started in 1598. So the other thing to note about it is that we're also going to start to recognise that a lot of the main features, like this water theatre, will appear all the way through. And so this water theatre, you know, is known as a Teatro dell'Acqua, which is like a water theatre. And again, they worked out an aqueduct of 8 kilometres to be able to move water into this location. Now, if you imagine that this is roughly on the side near the top of a hill, and we don't have pumps, then imagine what's involved in getting water to stay on a high level with a natural fall to get it to the top of this space of a hill to then allow it to fall down the hill. You're actually working against the very nature of water which wants to be at the bottom. And so in a way it's a really interesting process by which they did that. Now, on top of, you know, this is the statue in this is Hercules, and, you know, the water theatre itself, and there's Hercules in there, you know, and we can see that all of this stuff here are all figures, mostly figures from, I mean, maybe the effigies are from other people, but most of it is all memorialising, you know, Roman figures from people like Ovid. So you will have seen Ovid. And so a lot of this is where the way that the transition was able to be made from the pagan nature of the Roman tales into the Christian context was that they were taken no longer as referring to direct gods, but to be talking about analogies. And so this is a linguistic thing. And so analogies continue all the way through these gardens, and in fact all the way through gardens right up until the 20th century, where Greco-Roman analogies become analogies. You know, there's so many of them. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Pyrrhic victory. Have you heard of the Pyrrhic victory? It's a kind of classic war term that's also used in government, and a Pyrrhic victory is something where, you know, with a term to win the battle and lose the war refers to what's known as a Pyrrhic victory. And so, for example, that's an analogy. Even the analogy to lose the battle and to win the battle and lose the war comes from a story that translates its way through. So meaning-giving processes were part of these gardens. So when we also move past that space here towards the back, the character of the garden changes completely. And so when we move up through this, this is known as a water chain. This type of water feature is known as a water chain. And as we sort of move up here, we find these kind of grottos and bits and pieces in that landscape. And I have to say, I was walking, I think it was up this path when I discovered this here. And I was truly, it was a truly shocking thing because I was walking on my own, and I have to say it freaked the shit out of me when I saw that. Now, as you move up and up and up into that landscape, you notice that the whole character has changed. Now, a lot of this changed because of the fact that what was happening was dereliction during ownership, but you can see how nonetheless this whole character is really moving between this, first nature, third nature, moving between the wilderness is no longer about the wilderness. It's about fear of the other and playing with that, the titillation of something being a bit scary, being more natural, etc. Now, what's interesting is that the current prince who owns this garden says that Napoleon, who was related to the Aldobrandinis through marriage, took a whole lot of sculptures from this garden and promised to give them back one day before he got destroyed in Russia. And so it's interesting that there's there's all of these stories in families, and one of the other gardens that I'll talk about later has all these kind of stories as well. So what I'm going to do is actually talk about the garden on the right first, and then go back to the garden on the left. These two gardens would be, if I had to tell you two gardens that might well end up in your chat at the end of the semester, it would be these two gardens, Villa d'Este and Volante. And they're two, they're really very important gardens because, well, you know what? They're only important because everyone talks about them. You've got to say it. And so, in actual fact, this one here, Villa d'Este, which is on the right, or d'Este, is actually also in Tivoli. And so if we remember that Tivoli is where Villa Adriana was, and when I said Villa Adriana, the cardinal took a whole lot of sculpture from Villa Adriana and moved it into this place, we can see that that's the process of getting, the garden is populated by stuff from this garden. And so it's a really interesting garden, and I mean, I'm only telling these stories because of the fact that when I was a student, my teacher used to tell these stories. But I had this thing where I was working my guts out during my 20s to study landscape and succeed because I didn't get to university until I was in my, I was later, and I'd been a tradesman, etc. And so anyway, when I finished uni, I'd been teaching for 10 years. I didn't start travelling until I was 33. Prior to that, only left Australia to go to New Zealand. And so I was fully into doing the Grand Tour, and unfortunately my father passed away, but I was, I didn't have enough money to do anything with that money, but I had enough money to go on a decent trip to Europe. And so I chose to go to Europe and do things that I hadn't done before, which included having a bloody awesome dinner at the Villa d'Este. And so back then I was a smoker, but you guys, some of you have seen me as a smoker since then, but lucky strikes, yeah. And so the garden is, and it's interesting to say this as a kind of colonial to recognise that I was bewitched by all this stuff still. So here is the main sort of villa up here, and we can see that the villa is pretty small in comparison to the scale of the gardens. And so you can also see here from this view that the view and there's a space between this garden and Rome, So we're always, if I talked about these villas sort of orbiting around Rome, you can see that because there's always some belvedere somewhere where one can actually view the city or get that big view of the landscape. And so that was a really big part also. The term genius loci, which you might have come across, the spirit of the place, is something that comes from this period, although one could argue that once one was inside the garden, it generally was not about genius loci at all. It was actually about entire invention, engineering, allegories that were appropriated from Rome, etc. And so this again, we see this structure where we have these kind of switchbacks down to the level where we get to the main parterre, and we can also see that there's a sort of a main axis through here, actually, out to here, and another axis from the villa through here. And so sometimes students will do things that are symmetrical, and I will say to them, and they look really dull, and it's because good symmetry is highly complex. Because if irregular, then making something appear to be symmetrical in a highly irregular world is a very complex act. If we look at the fact that we've got one very regular axis that goes through the campus here, but we walked through those irregular other axes and we looked at how the different levels relate as they go down. It's a highly complex thing. And so here effectively they've got one axis running this way, another axis running this way, and that creates this sort of, I call it a parterre, but what I mean by that is a kind of box formation. Now, in the history of kind of landscape, a lot of people will talk about this box formation coming through what's known as the cloister in the garden, from the walled garden from the Middle Ages or whatever, but also from the Egyptian garden as well. So and from Islam. And so, for example, Gwen Harvey, Harvey, Gwen Fagan. Gwen Fagan, who is a great landscape historian in town, makes the argument that the company's garden is actually an Islamic garden, because a lot of this sort of configuration, she argues, predates the Italianate and comes in through the influence of Islam. So, nonetheless, this sort of switchback process off this thing, and this is called a loggia here, which is a sort of like a part of a building that overlaps onto a terrace that comes off the building, and often off this upper level would be the piano nobile. And so these switchback walks that come down, the first one of these is known as the Cardinals Walk, and that one is the process by which one goes from one side of the garden to the other. As one goes through this sort of switching back process, we get to the 100 fountains, and there's the 100 fountains there. And so obviously they're all this sort of series of fountains, which again is the process of adorning a retaining wall, right? Because if you're going to have so much grade change, you have to find a way of dealing with that negotiation. And you can see here how that grade change works its way down. You can also start to see amongst it all of these grottos. So if we think back to Villa Adriana, grottos are a really big feature of that, because they're also signifying the subterranean, the moist, the dank. And when we read things about, when we read about Gollum in Tolkien, it's all part of the analogy that the earthy, the ground, the dark, etc., and the titillation of something that is really is opposite to the light, or the sort of the order of society, etc., the order of religion. It's interesting that Martin Raincano, who's a colleague of mine, likes to say that he is of Argentine birth but raised in Berlin. He likes to say, in my office I get to have both worlds. I've got, I get to have the culture of the Italians and the Catholics, and the work ethic of the Protestants. And so within that, I think within the Italian culture that comes, that's very tied to Catholicism, is this thing between excess and discipline always, or the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Apollo being the god of discipline, effectively, and Dionysius being the god of wine. And so as you go through here, you also discover some other things. For example, this here is known as the oval fountain, which is designed by a guy called Piero Ligorio, who we're going to talk a lot about. And this large one here is known as the Fountain of Rometta, which is this one here. No, sorry, this is not the Fountain of Rometta. This is the Fountain of the Fountain of Neptune. It's actually created in the 20th century to replace something that was damaged. Now, there's also another fountain, which I think is this one. It's hard to see, but it's this one here, which is actually the Fountain of Rometta. And this is a miniature of Rome, with all these different parts of Rome. And so it's almost like a kitsch miniature of bits of Rome. Now, it's also important to look, when you look at this plan, to think about the fact that all of this is about different levels of scale and compartments. things. So we have obviously we have one order running through here, but then we have we have this order running through here, which sets up the grid, and then inside that we actually have strips that are running through until we get to this edge here, where we have a sort of an arrangement where these four imply this centre. And so within this, what seemingly simple part here is actually quite a lot of complexity. Now, obviously, these are the high points here on this edge around here, and so all of this is flowing down towards this edge down here. Now, Piero Ligorio, who worked on this, received a lot of attention for his work on this, and his name will come through, and it's a name that might be worth thinking about and remembering, this guy, Piero Ligorio, because his name comes up in quite a lot of projects. Now, the Villa Lante was a smaller garden that Ligorio also worked on. Now, Ligorio was essentially a classical scholar, and so that tells you something, because the that means that effectively good art was art that was closest to being old art. If you think about the idea that art now is about innovation, if you saw a piece of art that you might want to buy, you might want to buy it because you thought it was interesting, different, or whatever. But it's interesting that in these times, goodness, the quality of things was their relationship to the classical. And so therefore a good architect was a classicist. And that idea continued right the way through to the École des Beaux-Arts, and they have this thing now called the Prix de Rome, which the École des Beaux-Arts had as well, where if you won this prize of being the top student, you got sent to Rome, and you studied Rome, and that's how you learned how everything was right. Because when you got there, the Romans knew how to do it right, so everything you'd want to learn as an architect, you could learn by going to Rome. Therefore, architecture was like archaeology. It's a strange idea when you compare it to, because also the technology was like that. They're using aqueducts, that were moving water that the Romans had been using. They were using bridges and viaducts that the Romans were doing. So it's ironic that good taste was about the old at this particular point of time. Now, these drawings here, you might see some of these very nice drawings. They're done by a guy called Geoffrey Jellicoe and Peter Shepherd. I think it's Peter Shepherd. Might be wrong. Peter Shepherd, I think. Now, does anyone recognise this name, Jellicoe? I talked about it. Did anyone read my article I wrote? So, because he and his wife wrote The Landscape of Man, and so they did something which was a well-established thing, which was the Grand Tour, go to Europe, as I did. And so these drawings, watercolour drawings that you'll see throughout, beautiful drawings, are done by those guys in their book on Italian gardens. Now, the main parts of this, were undertaken in the sort of a lot of it till sort of a bit later, 1560 odd, and so this point, a lot of this was Piero Ligorio, who had also worked on the Villa d'Este, was a consultant on this in terms of, and was called an antiquarian, because it was like, what's good taste, what's right, what's not right. We'll consult with the ancients to understand what that might be. So the basis of this is two buildings which are called Cassini or Casino, which are these two small buildings here you can see, and those two were undertaken by a guy called Gambara. And a lot of this was also related to the Emperor Sixtus V, which is a really strange but interesting name, who was involved in restructuring Rome. Now, the hydraulics for this was undertaken by a guy called Tommaso Ginucci, who was a hydraulic engineer and architect from Siena. So it's interesting to see that when the discussions of the gardens are talked about, the engineering is talked about and really celebrated. So the garden design is a lot of the time undertaken by most of the time a collaboration between sculptor, engineer, and builder/architect. It's worth remembering that at this stage we don't have the profession of architect. What we have is people who've got money who go around studying old buildings and start drawing. That's what architecture had been right up until the 18th century. And so this I unfortunately had this terrible thing happen to me when I visited here, which was that it happens so this is the only reason that's not my photo, is that this was all under scaffolding and completely invisible when I went there, which was a tragedy. So again, we can see all that stuff I've been talking about, which is this process of ornamenting and ornamenting all of the negotiating structures with the terrain. And so, I often think if you stripped all of those down, if you made these bare walls, you made them white and you took all the details off it, it could look like modernism, essentially, because all this is the process of negotiation. Again, we see the transition between the parterre on the terrace, a range of terraces, and the progressive rustication of the garden as it moves to the top of the garden. Probably the most famous part, and certainly one of the most beautiful parts when I went there, was this water chain here, which is again a term you might want to sort of keep an eye on. So it's a water chain because one bit goes to another. What are these things known as? These edges here, technically, it's like a weir, but it's actually known as a rill. If you're designing water features, the thing that you overflow over is known as a rill. Just presumably we'll never design water features because there'll never be enough water again. But at the same time, I spent 2 years working for a water feature design company, and so I did a lot of time around these rills. And so you can also see here how looking down there, all of the different, the symmetry of the garden moves through a whole lot of different stages until it gets to that point there. And so this is actually known as the Fountain of Lamps, that fountain in the middle there. Okay. So you should be starting to notice some things about it now. I think the reason why this one is so liked is the intimacy of it. Now, the reason that I can't say that I particularly liked this garden, I thought it had some amazing spaces. But in a way, if you're going to go big like Versailles or go big like those gardens, there's something about the scale that I found funny, whereas the scale of this garden is just very intimate and quite beautiful, And so again, we can see all of this is just powered by gravity, so no pumps. So there's a real precision in the engineering of it, because don't forget that every time you have an overflow, if you have that not level, the water's going to go to one side versus the other. So there's a lot of technical stuff associated with this. So again, we can see this guy, Piero Ligorio again here. And so this garden's called Sacro Bosco, but I know it more as Bamazzo, the Gardens of Bamazzo, which is the family that owned it. But in a way, as we'll look at later, it's almost a picturesque. It's almost like a picturesque or an English garden. It's certainly got some of these structures, but we can see that the sort of the context of it is treed. The context of it is entirely, naturalistic, etc. I should just mention before we kind of continue much further that with Villa d'Este, when you look at all of the trees you see in the garden, those trees were only added in the 18th century. So in actual fact, that had been a terrace parterre water. And so a lot of the time, when you go back here and we go to this and we see a lot of these trees, a lot of the use of trees was something that came much, much later. Because in a way, the trees were about manipulation. If you go to this garden here, a lot of the trees were actually about pollarding. You see how the trees, this is known as pollarding, if you guys have come across that. It's where you can cut the tree back to knuckles, like this. And so nature was something to be manipulated. The garden was not about, it was about the differentiation from nature. And so Sacro Bosco is really interesting because it's a tragic story to some extent. So if you look at the garden itself, you'll see that it's full of, and that's why it's called the Park of Monsters now. Orsini, who was the sculptor here, his wife died, and out of the kind of tragedy of his wife dying, he created this very macabre garden. And you can see that it's got, it has buildings that are deliberately made to lean on an angle. It's got, I don't want to be copying. Here we go. Going back. You'll see that a lot of all through here are all of these different sculptures. Again, here's a wall. What do we do with the wall? We put something against it. We merge something into it. We try to get the most out of that functional surface. You know, big figures like this. Where's the turtle? There's a big catfishy kind of thing. Pineapple kind of thing. Where do we see this before? We would recognise something like this from Aldo Brandini, you know, and inside it we can see in the mouth is a little sort of feature, and so in a way this is actually an early sculpture garden, and so and you can see how as a landscape, I mean, now it's something like a public park, and so it's quite a mess, really. Now, Luke Morgan, who's a garden art scholar and garden historian, talks about this relationship of the garden as a place where the arcane, the pagan, the monstrous, the disgusting can be located. Because it's tied to the realms of nature, of which spirits had sort of been seen to be part of. In a way, this garden is part of a tradition which we'll see right the way through as we go through this history thing of embedding those things. A lot of the time we'll have stories involved with these figures, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting because it's like a prelude to the English garden to some extent. And there's, a lot of the time, if you want to follow the English garden through, you'll discover that gardens all the way through, except I would say the Islamic garden does not have this in its history. Is this sort of disgust, sort of gross, overscaled, the earthy, the pagan, etc. Now this is the Bobbly Gardens. Bobbly Gardens is in Florence. Florence, of course, is incredibly important because of the fact that it was one of the major economic centres, or probably the major economic centre with Venice during the Renaissance. And so while we've been talking about Rome, to some extent Rome was still in a process of recovery. It was old and historic. It was not actually really the economic centre as much as it had been the centre of the church and the Vatican, whereas Florence was. And so, Florence maintained a lot of power during this period. There's a whole lot of gardens, and so if we're looking at the kind of... Did you see something?
Battery's dying.
My battery's dying. Was it not plugged in?
It looked like you plugged in.
Uh-oh. Do not do. It must be, otherwise the monitor wouldn't go. Come on, do not die on me. I'm just this computer. I am. Be a friend. Be a friend. Is there any way that we can plug? It might be that this port is not the best. Yep, there we go. No. It wants to work. Let's just do this for a second. I blame Rude. I was saying. Yeah, and of course, Orsini is as you were pointing out, this guy is also a famous Renaissance artist. But yes, we were talking about the Bobbly Gardens, and so the Bobbly Gardens is really a Yes. Florence. We were talking about Florence. So I think you've got to also recognise that if there's a few major centres in Italy at the time, and there's also a few sort of garden sort of areas. And so if you're going to Italy, I really recommend that you think about visiting them, because obviously there's the ones at Rome, and the ones in Rome have got, Frascati, Tivoli, etc. Around them. And then you have the ones that are around Florence, of which there are a few. And then you also have the ones that are around Venice, the Veneto. And so there's a lot of different complexes. There's also some gardens further south as well. But the traditions are quite different because of the landscape types. And also, I think, with Florence, we also have to talk about economics and the fact that the zero, this is like, I love this story, but zero did not exist in the way that it was utilised. The decimal system did not exist. It's a product of trade, because it's a theoretical idea. Because can there be a zero? It's an abstraction. This is 1. What is 0? Nothing. Can you present nothing? Give me some nothing. No, I can't do that. So this is where the idea that you could have half of something as a decimal is odd, because if you cut this in half, what do you have? 2. You don't have half, you have 2. And so this is where a fundamental change in the way that numbers were thought of that corresponded with economics and double-digit bookkeeping. It came out of Venice originally, and Florence as well. And so we have to recognise this is the time when economics and trade is happening. Obviously, when we're talking about, I'm not talking about Venice specifically now, but if we were talking about Venice, we'd say this is also where trade is coming from the east through the Islamic world and through trading, which is trading also up into China, coming into Europe through Venice. We have a whole lot of movement of goods that are happening at this time, and so there's a few families that are really important, and probably the most famous one would be what? Medicis, that's right. And so the Medicis were really important, and in actual fact the Boboli Gardens is directly behind the Pitti Palace, which is the seat of the Medici Dukes of Tuscany. And so Medicis are also important because, when we go into France, in actual fact the Medicis Catherine de' Medici married the French kings, and that's where we end up with Louis, is via that way. So, and it's all tied to the Catholicism. So anyway, Boboli Gardens is also interesting now because to some extent this was what the garden looked like, but now it's actually largely a public park, and so it's got some really interesting parts to it. And the parts that are probably some of the most interesting parts are these grottoes. And so when you kind of, you look at them, you can see that, they're all around stalactites, stalagmites. Which are the tights? Which are the mites? I can never remember.
Mites go up, tights go down.
That makes sense, doesn't it? And so then, we also can see here, why I put 2 copies of the same picture in this, I don't know. But you can also see here all of these frescoes, and so that's also something which we saw in Italian gardens or Italian buildings, and we also see frescoes coming through from Egypt as well. And so a lot of these were made by people like Amanti, Vasari, and the sculptures were by Buonatelli. And so a lot of in the garden we have some of the finest artists of the Renaissance period operating in those spaces. And so you can see that the garden was also a platform for other art. And a lot of art at the time was statuary, was a big part of it. And so this is where a lot of those artists were practicing during that time. We also see, that the Bobley Gardens is another garden that has no natural water to it. And so a conduit was built from the river. And now the primary axis of the garden rises towards the Bobley Hill. And then the secondary axis was put in later. And the secondary axis, so there's a primary axis is this axis, but the secondary axis that I saw is basically this huge axis that runs across the sort of more truncated axis where it starts to move into the park. On the edges of that, you see this landscape, and it's a real classic. It's a classic landscape of the Italian villa and hill town with the cedars, with the olives, etc. And so, we can see that that's the sort of partly productive, partly wild, assembled around architecture. And so it's this sort of recipe that we get from those sort of gardens. Now, I'm just going to talk about two other gardens before we finish this part, and we are going to have another part, which is really, we're moving out of the Renaissance into the period that would be kind of called the Mannerist. And so, a lot of these gardens, by now, once we start to move into the 1600s and the late 1600s into the 1700s, we start to see that this continues, this tradition. And I had an interesting conversation, which I'll talk about in the lecture I give about French gardens, where an owner of a big French garden makes the case that that her garden, which is been called a Baroque garden, was not a Baroque garden, that it was a Renaissance garden. And indeed, the Baroque gardens were actually Renaissance gardens too. And so one of the most beautiful ones that I've seen is up, there's a part of Italy which is called the Lakes. This sort of area, and there's two lakes. There's lakes that I know of mostly, which is Lake Como and Lake Maggiore. And Como is the one everybody goes to, so I thought I'll go to Lake Maggiore. Again, one of my, it's a hard life. Drinking, Chianti by the. I haven't had the money to do anything like this since. But this island, Isola Bella, as it's called, is one of the Borromean Islands, and it's basically 400 metres from this town called Stresa, which is where I stayed. And it's really interesting to me that, this process that you kind of get to go to it, because you kind of go through this sort of rocky procession to get to the sort of pier down the bottom, and then once you get onto the boat, you sort of go through this sort of process where the island is 400 metres away, and as you get closer and closer and closer, it becomes increasingly more complex. Now, there's a thing called a megastructure. You won't have come across it yet as a concept necessarily, but the megastructure refers to a piece of architecture which almost operates like a landscape. It's so big that it's a structure that is landscape-like. And when you approach this island, you realise that it's been it was originally a kind of rocky crag, but it has been so manipulated that while we can call it a garden, you could almost call it a sort of a building, really, because it's completely organised, etc. And so when you enter into this sort of court space here, and then moving through that, you then move through a series of these kind of thresholds where you're kind of going through this building, and they're sort of partly landscape, partly building, as you make your way through. And so it's sort of almost, again, this sort of subterranean thing until you get to the top and that landscape and that building, you've just got a series of these terraces. And for me, it was, the terraces were almost not so interesting, but, the gardens along the edges that just occupying these terraces are quite incredible. So this is a level of gardening also that is much more, we're moving towards the 18th century, really, 17th, 18th century. And this is a level of gardening you would not have found in the Italian garden. The Italian garden was a very stripped back thing. It was not about plants. Plants were serving process of sort of occupying parterres or whatever. But this is a kind of romantic style that's much later, and recognises that we've moved into a different sort of period. And the final garden I'll talk about, which is it's almost moving into what I would call the kind of Rococo, is a garden called the Villa Garzoni. And the Villa Garzoni is I've got another weird story to tell about the Villa Garzoni. I decided that I wanted to see this thing because I was basically driving for this trip for 3 months. I leased a car and I drove from. I picked up the car in Rome and I drove it to Amsterdam, and it was 2003. And so I was stopped. I had a book. I was sort of driving along this road. I had no planning. I just here I'm going. Here's a book on gardens. Okay, I'm on this road. There's a garden nearby. And when I was in Florence, looking at the bobbly gardens, etc., I had this thing which is I always eat what the locals eat, because I figure if the locals are eating it, it has to be good. Otherwise, how could this happen? And so I was in Florence, and there was there were people, lots of different sorts of people eating this stuff, and it was like a vat filled with sort of boiling red water, and it had this sort of meat that was sort of like in strips like this, and they sort of cut a bit off and they put it in a roll, and I was eating it, and while I was eating it, my mother's voice popped into my head and said, "Julian, what are you doing? Do not eat that." And I was like, "No, she didn't really, that was not telepathy, it was imagination." But sure enough, about 3 days later, I started to be driving on this route, and I started to get really, really sick, and I started to feel like a bit delirious, and I'm driving the car. I spent one night, I went to Siena. I couldn't find any accommodation, so I pulled up by the side of the road in Siena next to a nightclub, basically, and just passed out in the car, and that was getting me sicker and sicker, and drove around Siena and got to this garden. And by this stage, I was getting quite sick, and so this was the garden, and it's quite an odd garden. I mean, it's from the 18th century, and you can see it because right here we've got stuff that you'll start to see from the Baroque garden. All of this sort of level of gravel with the sort of parterre forms, not inside a box, but actually making them up along the landscape. Here we can see a kind of standard. This is the older part. We can see the standard process between the switchbacks, the grottos, the water chains into the forest at the top, etc. I mean, it was very kitsch, this landscape, and I found it an interesting landscape. I can't say I thought it was a beautiful landscape. Here we can see another water chain, moving up through there, terrible res, etc. Obviously the fact is also that these landscapes, they're super expensive to maintain, and so it doesn't take much before they start to get a bit derelict. As we move up into the back, we can again start to see those sort of grotto-ish points where the water starts. So anyway, on this trip, I left here feeling really sick, and I started to drive up into the mountains. And I got to this town, and I was like a hill town, a proper Italian hill town. And I pulled my car up in front of this place, and I walked into the place, and I asked for something to eat. And I don't remember what happened, because I woke up after an unknown amount of time in a bed, but I had no idea what happened. And apparently I just actually became delirious. And the old sort of mama at the place got her 2 sons to carry me upstairs. And I had been violently ill and delirious for basically 3 days. And they couldn't speak English, and they were just looking after me, this beautiful Italian family. And I ended up spending 5 days up in this Italian hill town, and it was an amazing experience. But I don't remember much about this garden because I was basically losing it at that point of time. I don't even know the name of this town that I went to. I think I got really bad food poisoning, and I actually got so sick that I was totally delirious. They said that, as far as I could understand when they were going, "Ooh," that I was completely off my head. And when I woke up, I was dehydrated, and it took me. The mama was giving me soup, and I was making my way back into health. And they didn't even know how to contact my family or anything. No, I don't know. I've looked at maps to try to work out where it was. But it was quite funny because a whole lot of English tourists turned up to do painting, and they were on a painting kind of camp, and so I spent a bit of time with those guys. Okay, anyway, as we get towards the end of the Italian garden, I just wanted to talk about a 20th century Italian landscape architect, fantastic landscape architect, whose name is Pietro Porcini, which of course is like Peter of the mushrooms. And this is this garden of his, and obviously it's an older building. But I think what's amazing is that in the 1920s we have this thing where if you think about the fact that this campus was probably built in the 1920s, right? And so we can see it's the end of the Italianate, but then you get to this building that we start to see the sort of the start of modernism starting to make it in, a stripping back, etc. So people who were practicing in this period between 1920 and 1940, who weren't modernists, had a pretty tough time because effectively they were practicing in a way that was not what was really hot at the time. And so Porcini has only recently been starting to get the attention, but the work is quite interesting, so that, for example, if you look at it, you can see that it still has a parterre of hedging, etc. It still has a piano nobile kind of view onto this landscape to make out these kind of forms, as you can see from that view. So it's still a parterre, but it's quite abstract with these parts of them being grass, etc. But it's actually also a highly artificial structure because these, as you can see here, this whole surface is actually an artificial surface, and you could descend through that surface into an underground space, which is obviously a contemporary variant of the grotto. And so in a way, it's got a whole lot of constituents of the Italianate garden that have been explored and played with in a modern kind of way. Now, if we tried to do it now, it wouldn't work necessarily the same way. Now, a lot of the time in history, the way I try to talk about it is, as much as I'm talking to you about history, my real main interest more than that is the way that the history is available to us in a kind of selfish, appropriating kind of way as precedent. And so I think that what we can learn from these things is really around the Italianate garden, is the way that the language of landscape came up through the ornamentation of civil engineering, effectively, and the ornamentation of a process of levelling and a process of retaining. And in a way, a lot of it is that ornamentation of that. Okay, so that's the